Well, at the time, I had never heard of biblical criticism, and it never occurred to me to doubt the historical veracity of the Gospels. I just had a deep sense as I read the teachings of Jesus that what he said was true. Since then, I've attended seminary where I studied Hebrew and Greek and completed doctoral studies in theology, specializing on the historicity of the resurrection narratives in the New Testament. I've been gratified to discover that the intuitive trust which I, as a teenager, placed in the gospel accounts of Jesus' life and teaching was historically well-founded. It is nothing short of amazing to me that the historical facts which inductively imply the resurrection of Jesus are generally agreed upon today by New Testament scholars. These facts are as follows. Number one, on the Sunday following his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist in the resurrection reports, by far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. According to the New Testament critic D.H. Van Dalen, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. Fact number two, on multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. This is a fact which is almost universally acknowledged among New Testament scholars. Even the skeptical German New Testament critic Gert Lüdemann admits it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Finally, fact number three, the original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead despite their having every reason not to. Think of the situation that the disciples faced following Jesus' death. First of all, their leader was dead, and Jews had no belief in a dying, much less a rising Messiah. Moreover, Jesus' execution as a criminal showed him out to be a heretic, a man literally under the curse of God. Finally, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead prior to the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples believed in and were willing to go to their deaths for the fact of Jesus' resurrection. Luke Johnson, a New Testament scholar from Emory University, says, some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, that is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. There is no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these three facts. And therefore, it seems to me, the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be.
I do not deny that the disciples had an experience which they interpreted, which they took as being an appearance of Jesus. I think they probably did. Well, how do we account for that? How can we say that they could possibly have had such an experience? Well, once again, he far too quickly and dismissively disregards the explanation of hallucinations. I was just simply reading the Encyclopedia of Psychology recently. It says that 1/8 to 2/3 of normal human beings experience waking hallucinations. Now, one of the standard characteristics of many hallucinations is that they seem extremely real, very, very real. In fact, there are classes of hallucinations. For instance, there are hypnagogic, hypnopompic hallucinations, which are experienced, and the people who experience these hallucinations almost always say, yes, it seems so real.
And as I said, I'm not prepared to grant that these were hallucinations because you can't show any hallucination that fits the model of the resurrection appearances in all respects. And you might pick one hallucination that fits one aspect. here's another hallucination that fits another aspect. But there isn't anything that fits all of these in terms of the diversity, the range of people involved, and so forth. I mean, for example, James, Jesus' younger brother, we have good reason to believe he was not a believer in Jesus during his lifetime. And yet we know also, we have good testimony that he was a firm believer and leader of the New Testament church afterwards. Now, how do you explain the fact of James' conversion from being an unbeliever to being prepared to die? And he did die. Josephus tells us James died for his belief that his older brother was the Lord. Now, what would cause you or me to believe your brother is the Lord? You know, apart from what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, then he appeared to James. And you can't write that off as hallucinatory because James was an unbeliever. And similarly, Paul, you know, was an unbeliever. So it's this diversity that I think makes the hallucination hypothesis less credible.
Can we come to some claims? You had talked about the idea of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yes, indeed.
The question I've got is, what would that extraordinary evidence be in the first century? You didn't have video cameras, you didn't have scientific tests, so what would that look like if you were looking for extraordinary evidence?
What would, gosh, you know, that makes it especially difficult, of course, right? It makes it especially difficult in justifying any miraculous claims from those days. And I think that's not a problem for me in any sense at all. That's a problem for the people who are claiming the miracles. The paucity of evidence, you know. If there had been a video camera there at the door of the tomb, you know, and we could see the angel coming down, rolling aside the big stone, that sort of thing, well, I would say probably, first of all, it was made in the Walt Disney Studio. That would be my first hypothesis. You know, that Steven Spielberg had something to do with it. You know, Gospel of Matthew is incredibly Spielbergian. You ought to make a movie of it, okay. But, you know, that would be my first hypothesis. But, you know, you raise a legitimate issue, but, you know, I'd simply have to point out that's not a problem for me. That's a problem for anybody that wants to claim a miracle.
And what I fear from your response is that this watchword, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, is really just an excuse for an a priori rejection of the miraculous, because you weren't, or you didn't give any sort of evidence that would satisfy you with respect to one of these extraordinary claims. It made it sound like, to me, you were saying that nothing would convince you, no matter what.
No, all sorts of things would convince me.
Well, with respect to the resurrection, though, I mean, you even said if there was a video camera, you'd say it was a fake stone that was rolled away. You know, I mean, what sort of...
That would be the more reasonable hypothesis under the circumstances.
Well, but see, that's what I fear. It is. It's just an a priori rejection of the miraculous here. You're not. There isn't any kind of literary testimony, historical testimony that could convince you.
So once again, these extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence in no way implies a bias against the supernatural. It's simply an application of a rule which we use in our daily lives.
But you're saying that when you say extraordinary, really what you're saying is no amount of evidence would convince me of these extraordinary claims.
Sure it would. If tomorrow morning, immediately after breakfast, suddenly there was an earthquake, you know, and a silvery light shone in the sky, and the leaves dropped from the trees. And I dashed outside, and there, towering over us like 100 Everests, was this giant figure with lightning playing around his Michelangeloid face. And he pointed down and saying, "Be assured, Keith M. Parsons, that I do in fact exist, and I'm sick of your logic chopping." Dr. Craig, I would join you in the pew of the church, in the front pew of the church the next Sunday. You know.
Be going to the question and answer period. We're going to go to the question and answer period, so be going to the microphone as we wind this down.
You don't think that you would have said, "Boy, I was having a hallucination."
Not.